Sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not in battle, but in the quiet moments when nobody is watching. In the harsh world of ancient Norway, where strength meant survival, one giant warrior chose compassion over conquest. Bjorn Ketilson was 7 feet tall and feared by his enemies. But every evening, he served warm food to Eldar, an old man with no family and no money. The other warriors laughed at this strange friendship. Why would their strongest fighter waste time feeding a useless old storyteller? Bjorn never cared what they thought. Every day for months, he brought Eldar his meal and listened to ancient songs nobody else remembered. Then one morning, Eldar was gone. In his place sat a wooden box with Bjorn's family symbol carved into it. Inside was something that would change everything Bjorn believed about his own bloodline. What secret had the old man been keeping? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Great Hall of Rafheim stretched wide beneath soaring timber beams, blackened by decades of hearth smoke and countless winter nights. Iron braziers cast dancing shadows across carved pillars that told stories of victories long past, while the scent of pine resin and roasted meat hung thick in the air. Here, where the clan gathered each evening to share food and tales, the hierarchy of strength ruled all. The strongest warriors sat closest to the fire, their voices carrying the weight of respect earned through blood and blade. Bjorn Ketilson occupied the seat of honor at the high table, his massive frame dwarfing the oak chair that groaned beneath his weight. At 7 feet tall with shoulders broad as a ship's beam, he commanded attention without speaking a word. His beard, the color of autumn wheat, hung in carefully braided knots adorned with silver rings that caught the firelight. Scars crisscrossed his forearms like a map of battles fought and won, each mark telling its own story of survival. The other warriors respected him not just for his size, but for the calm wisdom that tempered his strength. Unlike many who sought glory through reckless courage, Bjorn fought with the patience of a man who understood that living to see another dawn mattered more than dying for fleeting fame. He had earned his place through 20 years of raids and battles, his war axe Ironbane becoming legend among both friend and foe. Yet for all his fearsome reputation, Bjorn possessed a gentleness that puzzled many. Children would run to him without fear, knowing he always carried honeyed nuts in his pouch. When disputes arose between clansmen, they often sought his judgment, trusting his fairness over the harsh decisions of younger, more volatile leaders. His voice, deep as rolling thunder, could soothe as easily as it could command. This evening, like every evening for the past 4 months, Bjorn's attention turned to a shadowed corner near the hall's edge where Eldar sat alone. The old man perched on a 3-legged stool that wobbled with his slight movements, his frail shoulders wrapped in a threadbare cloak that had once been fine wool. Age had bent his spine and thinned his white hair to wisps, but his pale blue eyes remained sharp as winter sky. Eldar had arrived at Rafheim during the harvest season, claiming to be a traveling skald seeking shelter before the snows. He carried no weapons, no gold, no family name that commanded respect. In a world where worth was measured by what a man could take or defend, Eldar possessed nothing but stories. The clan leader, Jarl Thorvald, had granted him permission to stay through winter, as custom demanded hospitality to wandering storytellers. But few paid the old man much attention. Most evenings, Eldar sat forgotten while younger skalds entertained the hall with rousing tales of recent victories. The warriors preferred stories that celebrated their own deeds, not the ancient sagas that Eldar seemed to favor. His voice, though still clear, lacked the booming power needed to command a rowdy hall's attention. So he remained in his corner, accepting whatever scraps of food came his way, his stories unheard. Bjorn had first noticed the old man during his 2nd week at Rafheim. While others feasted and boasted, Eldar sat quietly, his worn wooden bowl empty, too proud to beg but clearly hungry. Something about the dignity in the old man's bearing stirred Bjorn's memory of his own grandfather, a warrior who had lived too long and watched his strength fade, while younger men forgot his contributions. Without fanfare or announcement, Bjorn had simply filled a bowl from his own portion and set it before Eldar. The old man had looked up with surprise, then gratitude, but said nothing. Neither did Bjorn. The warrior returned to his seat, and the evening continued as if nothing had happened. But the next night, Bjorn did it again. And the next. Soon it became routine each evening, as the hall filled with noise and warmth. Bjorn would quietly serve Eldar a full meal from his own generous portion. The old man never asked for this kindness, and Bjorn never expected thanks. It simply felt right, like honoring the memory of elders who had shaped him. The other warriors began to notice, of course. Whispers followed Bjorn's nightly journey to Eldar's corner. Some called it weakness, claiming their champion had grown soft. Others wondered if the old man had cast some spell over the giant. A few suggested Eldar must be hiding gold or valuable secrets to earn such attention. Why waste good food on that useless old crow? Magnus Redbeard had asked one night, loud enough for half the hall to hear. He contributes nothing. Can't swing a sword, can't work the fields, can barely tell a story worth hearing. Bjorn had simply looked at Magnus with those steady gray eyes that could freeze a man's blood when angry. A warrior's strength is measured not just by what he can destroy, but by what he chooses to protect, he had replied. The conversation ended there, but Bjorn's interest in Eldar went beyond mere charity. During their brief exchanges, a word of thanks, a comment about the weather, a question about the evening's meal, Bjorn had begun to sense depths in the old man that others missed. There was knowledge behind those pale eyes, wisdom earned through years of observation and experience. When Eldar did speak, his words carried weight, carefully chosen and precisely delivered. One evening, as Bjorn set down the bowl of venison stew, Eldar had spoken quietly. "You have your grandfather's hands." The words had stopped Bjorn cold. He had never mentioned his grandfather to anyone at Rafnheim, and the old man's name was not widely known beyond their home fjord. "You knew Gunnar Ironbeard?" Bjorn had asked, settling onto a nearby bench. "I knew of him," Eldar had replied carefully. "Stories reach far, young warrior. Some men leave marks on the world that outlive their bodies." That conversation had opened the door between them. In the nights that followed, while the hall roared with drinking songs and boastful tales, Bjorn would linger in Eldar's corner, listening to stories unlike any he had heard. The old skald spoke of heroes whose names had been forgotten by all but the most ancient songs, of battles fought for reasons more complex than simple conquest, of wisdom passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. Eldar never told these stories to the hall. They were shared quietly, privately, as if they were secrets too valuable to waste on unworthy ears. He spoke of Bjorn's own bloodline with a familiarity that seemed impossible, mentioning ancestors by name, describing family traditions that Bjorn thought were known only to his closest kin. "Your line carries more than warrior's blood," Eldar had said one night, his voice barely audible above the hall's noise. "There are songs about the Ketilsons that even the wisest skalds have forgotten. Songs of choices made in darkness, of prices paid in silence." The old man's words carried an undertone that Bjorn couldn't quite grasp, as if Eldar was trying to prepare him for something without speaking it directly. When Bjorn pressed for details, Eldar would only shake his head and say, "Some truths must be discovered, not told. The finding of them changes a man more than the knowing." Tonight felt different. As Bjorn carried the usual bowl across the hall tonight, it held thick barley porridge with chunks of salted pork and winter vegetables. He noticed Eldar's unusual stillness. The old man sat straighter than usual, his hands folded carefully in his lap, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the hall's walls. "The snows are deepening," Bjorn said as he set down the bowl. Following his usual routine of simple conversation, Eldar looked up at him with an expression that seemed somehow final. "Yes," he said. "Winter teaches us about endings, doesn't it? And beginnings." Something in the old man's tone made Bjorn pause. "Are you well, Elder?" "As well as any man can be when his work is nearly finished." Eldar's fingers traced the rim of his worn wooden bowl, the same bowl he had carried since arriving at Rathnheim, its surface smooth from years of use. "Tell me, Bjorn Ketilson, what do you know of your father's father?" "Gunnar Ironbeard? He died when I was young. A good warrior, they said. Honorable. And his father?" Bjorn frowned. "Ketil the Wise. He founded our line, chose our name. But that was long ago, 3 generations past." Eldar nodded slowly. 3 generations. Long enough for truth to become legend, and legend to become lie. He lifted the bowl and took a careful sip of the porridge. "This is good. You choose your provisions well." The conversation felt unfinished, heavy with unspoken meaning. But before Bjorn could ask more questions, a commotion near the hall's entrance drew his attention. A messenger had arrived, bearing news from a neighboring settlement. By the time Bjorn looked back, Eldar had returned to his meal. The moment of revelation passed. That night, as the hall slowly emptied and the fires burned low, Bjorn found himself thinking about Eldar's strange questions. Why the interest in his bloodline? What truth could have become lie in just 3 generations? He fell asleep with those questions churning in his mind. Unaware that tomorrow would bring answers he was not prepared to receive, dawn came gray and bitter, with winds that howled through the gaps in the hall's wooden walls like restless spirits seeking warmth. Bjorn woke to the sound of snow pelting the shutters, the storm that had threatened for days finally arriving with winter's full fury. The great hall felt different in the morning, light quieter, emptier, as if the previous night's warmth had been nothing but a dream. He dressed methodically, as was his habit, checking his weapons and gear before breaking his fast. The routine calmed him, though he couldn't shake the memory of Eldar's strange words from the night before. 3 generations. Truth becoming legend, legend becoming lie. What had the old man meant? The hall stirred slowly to life around him. Servants moved quietly between the tables, clearing away the remnants of the previous night's feast. The great hearth had been fed fresh logs, but its warmth barely reached the corners where shadows still lingered. Most of the warriors remained in their sleeping alcoves, nursing sore heads and reluctant to face the cold morning. Bjorn made his way toward Eldar's corner, expecting to find the old man already awake and quietly contemplating the day ahead. It was Eldar's custom to rise early, often sitting in meditation before the hall fully woke. But the 3-legged stool stood empty, Eldar's threadbare cloak nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he had sought the privy, or stepped outside despite the storm. Bjorn waited, watching the shadows for the familiar bent figure. Minutes passed. The morning meal was prepared and served, the hall gradually filling with the sounds of daily life. But still no sign of Eldar. A cold certainty began to settle in Bjorn's chest. He approached one of the servants, a young woman named Astrid, who often helped with the morning preparations. "Have you seen the old skald this morning?" he asked. Astrid shook her head. "No, lord, not since last evening. Perhaps he sleeps late." But Eldar never slept late. The old man rose with the dawn, claiming that the early hours brought the clearest thoughts. Bjorn felt his unease growing as he searched the hall more thoroughly, checking every corner and alcove where the old man might have sought shelter from the cold. It was then that he noticed it, sitting precisely in the center of Eldar's usual place, positioned where the old man would normally set his worn wooden bowl. A carved wooden box, no larger than a man's 2 hands, its surface dark with age and polished to a deep shine. Bjorn approached slowly, his warrior's instincts alert to potential danger. The box was beautifully crafted, clearly the work of a master woodcarver. Strange symbols were etched into its lid runes, but not ones he immediately recognized. At the center, burned deep into the wood, was a symbol that made his breath catch: his family mark. The interlocking circles and crossed spears that had identified the Ketilson line for 3 generations. But something was wrong with it. The mark had been altered, additional lines added that changed its meaning in ways Bjorn couldn't understand. It was his symbol, yet not his symbol, familiar yet foreign. With hands that trembled slightly, Bjorn lifted the box. It was heavier than expected, solid wood throughout, with a lid that fit so perfectly it seemed molded as one piece. No visible hinges or clasps marked its surface. Yet, when he pressed gently on the altered family mark, the lid shifted with a soft click dot inside. Nestled in black wool like precious grave goods lay 3 objects that would shatter everything Bjorn thought he knew about his heritage. The first was a silver arm ring, tarnished black with age but still bearing the intricate knotwork that marked it as a piece of exceptional value. Bjorn recognized the style. It was old, older than anything in his family's possession, crafted in the manner of the great smiths from the time of the Sea Kings. Engraved around its inner surface were runes that spelled out a name: Ketil the Bloody, not Ketil the Wise, as Bjorn had always been told. Ketil the Bloody. The second object was a small piece of cloth, stained dark brown with what could only be ancient blood. The fabric was fine, clearly cut from a nobleman's cloak or banner. More runes were embroidered along its edge, but these Bjorn could not read. They belonged to an older tradition, from before the common runic alphabet had been standardized. The third object drove all thought from his mind: a carved bone token, yellowed with age, depicting a scene that made his stomach clench with horror. Warriors slaughtering unarmed people, women, children, elderly men, while a figure bearing the Ketilson mark looked on. Beneath the carving, more of the ancient runes, but these he could puzzle out with effort. The price of betrayal, blood for blood, generation unto generation. Bjorn sank onto the empty stool, the box trembling in his hands. The implications crashed over him like a cold wave. His ancestor, the founder of his proud bloodline, had not been Ketil the Wise as family stories claimed. He had been Ketil the Bloody, and these artifacts suggested atrocities committed in the name of the Ketilson line. But there was more. Beneath the 3 objects, pressed flat against the box's bottom, was a piece of parchment covered in Eldar's careful script. Bjorn unfolded it with shaking fingers and read: "Young warrior, by the time you find this, I will be gone from Raffenheim, my purpose here completed. For 4 moons I have watched you, testing your character, measuring your heart. You are not your ancestor, and for this I am grateful. The kindness you showed an old man proves that the blood debt need not define you, though it will surely find you. Your great-grandfather was not the wise leader your family remembers. He was a kinslayer and oath-breaker who murdered my family under a flag of truce. My father, my brothers, my sister's young children all cut down while they slept, believing themselves safe under guest right. Ketil took their lives to claim lands that were never his by right, then spread lies about their treachery to justify his actions. I have spent 30 years gathering proof of these crimes, tracking down witnesses, collecting artifacts like those you now hold. I came to Raffenheim seeking vengeance, prepared to spill your blood as payment for theirs. But watching you these months, seeing your honor, your compassion for the weak and forgotten, I have learned that you are not the man your ancestor was. The blood debt remains, but I leave its settlement to you. In 3 days' time, at the stone circle north of Ravensham, others will gather survivors of Ketil's crimes and their descendants, seeking justice long delayed. They will expect blood payment. Whether they receive it, and from whom, is now your choice to make. The map shows the way. The truth shows the cost. Honor your conscience, Bjorn Ketilson, for you may be the first of your line to truly deserve the name of warrior." The parchment crackled in Bjorn's grip as the hall continued its morning routine around him. oblivious to the earthquake that had just shattered his world. Everything he had believed about his family, his heritage, his very identity, lay in ruins. His great-grandfather, the man whose name he bore with pride, had been a murderer of innocents, and somehow, an old skald he had fed from kindness had known it all. The worn wooden bowl sat abandoned on the nearby table, the simple vessel that had connected them now seeming to mock his grief. Eldar was gone, vanished into the storm, leaving behind only questions and a terrible choice. 3 days at Revensham's stone circle, a reckoning 30 years in the making. Bjorn stared at the bone token, at the carved scene of massacre, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The man who had woken this morning was gone. In his place sat someone who would have to decide what honor truly meant when faced with the sins of the past. Outside, the storm raged on, but its fury was nothing compared to the tempest now brewing in Bjorn Ketilson's heart. The carved wooden box sat before Bjorn like a curse made manifest, its contents spread across the rough table in Eldar's abandoned corner. The silver arm ring gleamed dully in the morning light, while the blood-stained cloth and bone tokens seemed to absorb the shadows around them. Each artifact whispered accusations that cut deeper than any blade. Bjorn's hand shook as he carefully returned the items to their black wool nesting places. The letter crinkled as he folded it, Eldar's words burning in his memory. The blood debt remains, but I leave its settlement to you. 3 days to decide whether to face the descendants of his ancestors' victims. 3 days to choose between preserving his family's honor and acknowledging their shame. The morning routine of Rafheim continued around him, warriors breaking their fast and discussing the day's plans. But Bjorn felt removed from it all, as if he observed their world through thick ice. Magnus Redbeard was holding court near the main hearth, regaling younger warriors with an embellished tale of his latest raid. The familiar boasting that had once seemed merely tiresome now sounded hollow, even grotesque. "Bjorn!" called Thorvald Greybeard from across the hall. The scouts report strange tracks near the eastern boundary. Wolfsheim, but larger than usual. Will you lead a hunting party? Bjorn looked up, meeting the Jarl's eyes with effort. Thorvald had ruled Rafenheim for 15 years, his leadership marked by wisdom and fairness. He trusted Bjorn's judgment in matters of defense and hunting, often seeking his counsel on difficult decisions. The thought of deceiving this good man about the crisis gnawing at his soul made Bjorn's stomach clench. "Perhaps Magnus should lead this hunt," Bjorn replied carefully. He spoke last night of wanting fresh wolf pelts for winter trade. Thorvald's weathered face showed surprise. Bjorn had never declined a hunting opportunity, especially one involving potential threat to the settlement. "Are you unwell, my friend? You seem just tired from the storm," Bjorn interrupted, hating the lie even as he spoke it. "The wind kept me wakeful." The Jarl nodded, though his eyes remained concerned. "Very well. Magnus, gather 6 men and track these wolves. But be cautious. Strange sign often means strange dangers." As the hunting party organized itself with typical warrior enthusiasm, Bjorn retreated further into his own thoughts. The map Eldar had left showed a route north through the mountain passes to Ravensham, a journey of 2 hard days through treacherous winter terrain. The stone circle mentioned in the letter was ancient, predating the current settlements by centuries. It was a place where old laws still held sway, where blood debts could be formally acknowledged or challenged. But what would he find there? How many descendants of Ketil's victims still lived? What form would their demand for justice take? The bone token's carved scenes suggested the massacre had been extensive, families destroyed, bloodlines ended. The survivors who escaped would have carried their grief across generations, nurturing it like a sacred flame. "You look like a man who has seen his own death," said a familiar voice. Bjorn looked up to find Ragnhild standing beside him, her weathered face creased with concern. Thorvald's wife was a woman of sharp wit and gentle wisdom, respected by all the clan for her healing skills and her ability to see through pretense. She carried a steaming bowl of herb tea, its aromatic steam cutting through the morning chill. "Drink," she said, setting the bowl before him. "Chamomile and honey with a touch of meadowsweet. Good for troubled minds." Bjorn accepted the tea gratefully, letting its warmth seep into his cold hands. Ragnhild settled onto a nearby stool, her keen eyes studying his face with the intensity of someone reading ancient runes. "The old skald left in the night," she said quietly. "Strange to travel in such a storm. Strangers still to leave no farewell for the man who showed him such kindness." The observation hit too close to truth. Bjorn kept his expression neutral, though he suspected Ragnhild could read his discomfort anyway. She had a gift for seeing what others missed, a quality that made her invaluable as both healer and counselor. "Perhaps he felt his welcome had worn thin," Bjorn said carefully. "Few here appreciated his stories, but you did." Her statement carried no question, only quiet certainty. "Each evening you brought him food and listened to his tales. What did he tell you, Bjorn Ketilson? What words did he share that now sit so heavy on your heart?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. For a moment, he considered telling her everything, laying out the artifacts, sharing Eldar's letter, seeking her counsel on the impossible choice before him. Ragnhild had guided many through difficult decisions, her wisdom earned through decades of helping others navigate life's complexities. But the shame was too great, the implications too dangerous. If the truth about Ketil the Bloody became known, it would destroy more than just Bjorn's reputation. The entire clan structure depended on bloodline honor, on the belief that their leaders descended from worthy ancestors. To reveal that the Ketilson line was founded on betrayal and murder would shatter confidence in the traditional order. "Old stories," he said finally. "Ancient tales of heroes long forgotten. Nothing that matters now." Ragnhild's eyes narrowed slightly. She knew he was lying, but respected his choice to keep his troubles private. "Ancient tales have a way of becoming very immediate when they touch our present," she said. "If you find yourself in need of counsel, remember that some burdens grow lighter when shared." She rose to leave, then paused. The old skald was not what he appeared to be. I sensed something in him of purpose that went deeper than mere storytelling. "Be careful, Bjorn. Sometimes the past reaches out to claim what it feels it is owed." Her words sent ice through his veins. How much had she guessed? How much did others suspect? As Ragnhild moved away to tend her other duties, Bjorn found himself studying the hall's occupants with new paranoia. Did Magnus's loud laughter carry a mocking edge? Did young Olaf's glances hold suspicion? Were they all waiting for some revelation that would explain his strange behavior? The morning dragged on with agonizing slowness. Bjorn made efforts to appear normal, checking weapons, discussing winter preparations, reviewing the settlement's defenses, but everything felt forced and hollow. The carved box remained hidden beneath his cloak, its weight a constant reminder of the choice looming before him as the sun reached its pale midday peak, visible only as a slightly brighter patch in the overcast sky. A commotion arose near the hall's entrance. The hunting party had returned early, their faces grim with failure and something else, fear. Magnus Redbeard strode to the center of the hall, his usual bluster replaced by troubled uncertainty. "The tracks we followed were not made by wolves," he announced. "The size was right, but the pattern was wrong. Too purposeful, too intelligent. And they led to something we could not explain." He reached into his pouch and withdrew an object that made several warriors step back in alarm. It was another carved bone token, similar to the one hidden in Bjorn's box, but larger and more elaborate. This one depicted a great tree with many branches, some flourishing, others broken and dead. Ancient runes covered its surface, their meaning lost to most present. "We found this place deliberately on a stone cairn. positioned where anyone following the strange tracks would discover it. Magnus continued. It feels like a message, but we cannot read its meaning. Thorvald took the token, turning it over in his weathered hands. These are old runes, from before my grandfather's time. We would need a learned skald to interpret them properly. He looked around the hall. A pity our recent guest chose to leave so abruptly. Such mysteries were his specialty. The bitter irony was not lost on Bjorn. Eldar could indeed have read those runes, could have explained their significance. But the old skald's departure was not coincidence. It was part of a larger plan that was now unfolding with inexorable purpose. As discussion swirled around the mysterious token, Bjorn felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The blood debt was calling in its markers, and time was running short to decide how he would answer. The evening meal passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Bjorn sat in his usual place at the high table, mechanically consuming roasted deer and dark bread while the hall buzzed with speculation about the mysterious bone token. Warriors offered theories ranging from ancient curses to messages from rival clans, but none came close to the truth that gnawed at Bjorn's consciousness. The token itself rested on Thorvald's table, its carved surface catching the firelight as men leaned in for a closer examination. Several claimed to recognize portions of the runic script, but their interpretations contradicted each other wildly. The uncertainty only fed the growing unease that had settled over Raffenheim like morning fog. Perhaps we should send word to the wise woman at Thornvale, suggested Ericsson the Tall, a grizzled veteran whose opinions carried weight. Old Ingrid knows the ancient scripts better than anyone in 3 settlements. That would take a full week, Thorvald replied, stroking his gray beard thoughtfully. Riders there and back, assuming the mountain passes remain clear. I fear we lack that luxury. Why? Magnus demanded, his voice carrying its usual edge of aggression. What threat does an old bone trinket pose to warriors of Raffenheim? The Jarl's expression grew grave. Because it was not left by chance, old friend. Someone wanted us to find it, wanted to deliver a message we cannot read. In my experience, such mysteries rarely bring good fortune. Bjorn found himself studying each face around the table, wondering if any of them suspected the truth. Did Thorvald's weathered features hide knowledge of old family secrets? Did Magnus's bluster conceal awareness of ancient crimes? The paranoia felt irrational, yet he could not shake the sensation of being watched, judged, found wanting. As the evening wore on and ale loosened tongues, conversations grew louder and more speculative. Young Olaf, barely 17 and eager to prove his worth, declared his readiness to face whatever enemies might be gathering. His boldness earned approving nods from older warriors who remembered their own youth. Let them come, Olaf proclaimed, raising his drinking horn high. Raffenheim has never bowed to threats, ancient or otherwise. Our blades are sharp, our courage proven. The declaration drew cheers from around the hall, but Bjorn felt only a hollow ache in his chest. How could he explain that the enemy they faced was not approaching from outside, but had been living among them all along? That the very bloodline they trusted to defend them was founded on betrayal and murder? Unable to bear the irony any longer, Bjorn excused himself and stepped into the bitter night air. The storm had passed, leaving the world transformed beneath a blanket of pristine snow that crunched beneath his boots. Stars glittered like ice crystals in the clear sky, their cold light offering no comfort to his troubled mind. Behind him, the hall's warm glow spilled through cracks in the shutters. Accompanied by the sounds of fellowship and security he no longer felt part of. The weight of Eldar's carved box pressed against his ribs where he kept it hidden, a constant reminder of the choice, bearing down on him with each passing hour. 2 days remained until the gathering at Ravensham's stone circle. 2 days to decide whether to honor his family's reputation or acknowledge their guilt. The letter had been clear others would be there, survivors of Ketil's crimes and their descendants, seeking justice long delayed. They would expect blood payment, and Bjorn was the only living representative of the line that owed the dead. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he walked the settlement's perimeter, past the storage buildings and workshops that housed the community's wealth. Every structure represented the labor and sacrifice of good people who trusted their leaders to protect them. If the truth about the Ketilson line emerged, it would shatter more than just his personal honor. It would undermine the entire social structure that held their world together. Yet how could he continue living a lie? How could he accept the respect and trust of his companions while knowing it was built on his ancestors' crimes? The bone tokens carved scene haunted his thoughts, women and children, slaughtered while a figure bearing his family's mark watched. Even if he had not committed those murders personally, did he not bear some responsibility for the bloodline's sins? A soft footstep in the snow made him turn. Ragnhild approached quietly, her healing satchel slung across her shoulder, and her expression filled with maternal concern. "I thought I might find you here," she said gently. Troubled men often seek the cold when their thoughts burn too hot for comfort. "The night air helps me think clearly," Bjorn replied, though clarity was the last thing his churning mind offered. And what thoughts require such bitter contemplation? She moved to stand beside him, gazing up at the star-filled sky. "I have known you since you were Olaf's age, Bjorn Ketilson. Never have I seen you carry such weight in your shoulders." The temptation to confess everything nearly overwhelmed him. Ragnhild had guided him through many difficulties over the years, her wisdom earned through decades of tending both physical wounds and emotional pain. If anyone might offer counsel on his impossible situation, it would be her. But the risk was too great. If he revealed the truth about Ketil the Bloody, he would be asking her to share a burden that could destroy them all. Better that he face this choice alone than corrupt her with knowledge she could never safely use. "Old memories," he said finally. "Stories my grandfather told that I had forgotten until recently. Sometimes the past feels closer than it should." Ragnhild nodded slowly, her breath forming silver clouds as she considered his words. "The old Skald's departure troubles you." It was not a question, and Bjorn saw no point in denying what she had already deduced. "He knew things about my family that seemed impossible for a stranger to know. It makes me wonder what other secrets might be buried in our bloodline." "All families carry secrets, child. Some are shameful, others merely private. The measure of a man lies not in his ancestors' deeds, but in his own choices." She turned to face him directly, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Whatever burden you carry, remember that you are not responsible for choices made before your birth." Her words offered comfort, but only briefly. How could he explain that the burden was not just knowledge, but the demand for action? That in 2 days, he would have to choose between perpetuating a lie and facing consequences that could destroy everything he held dear. "The young men speak eagerly of battle tonight," Ragnhild continued. "They see the mysterious token as a challenge to be met with blade and courage. But you know better, don't you? You understand that some enemies cannot be defeated through violence." The observation cut too close to truth. Bjorn kept his expression neutral, though he suspected she could read his discomfort anyway. "What would you do?" he asked carefully. "If you discovered that someone you trusted had built their reputation on lies? Someone whose honor others depended upon? I would ask myself whether exposing those lies would serve justice or merely satisfy my need to feel superior." She replied without hesitation. "Truth is valuable, but so is the welfare of the innocent. Sometimes wisdom lies in protecting people from knowledge they cannot bear." The answer was not what he had hoped for: clear guidance, pointing toward a single righteous path. Instead, she had given him another perspective to weigh, another layer of complexity to consider. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the aurora begin to dance across the northern sky in sheets of green and gold. The display was beautiful, but Bjorn could find no peace in it. Even nature's wonder felt distant now, separated from him by the gulf of his knowledge. Eventually, Ragnhild excused herself to check on a pregnant woman whose time was near. Her departure left Bjorn alone with his thoughts and the weight of tomorrow's consequences. Whatever choice he made at Ravensham would echo through generations, just as Ketil's crimes had echoed down to him. The question was no longer what he should do, but what he could live with afterward. Dawn brought no relief from the torment that had plagued Bjorn through the sleepless night. He had lain on his sleeping furs staring at the rafters, watching shadows shift as the banked fires flickered, while his mind churned through endless variations of the choice before him. Each path seemed to lead to destruction of his honor, his family's legacy, or the innocent people who depended on both. The morning routine felt surreal as he moved through familiar motions with unfamiliar dread. Checking his weapons revealed trembling hands that had never shaken before battle. Breaking his fast turned each bite to ash in his mouth. Even the simple act of greeting fellow warriors felt like betrayal. Knowing the secret that festered between them, as he attempted to lose himself in mundane tasks, resharpening an already keen blade, organizing gear that needed no attention, a commotion near the hall's entrance demanded his notice. 2 riders had arrived despite the early hour, their horses lathered with sweat and steaming in the cold air. The urgency of their journey was written in every line of their posture. Thorvald emerged to greet them personally, his weathered face grave with the concern that unexpected messengers always brought. The riders dismounted stiffly, their travel-stained clothes and exhausted expressions speaking of hard riding through dangerous conditions. "Jarl Thorvald," the elder rider began, his voice hoarse from cold and fatigue. "I am Gunther of Blackstone Ridge. We bring word from the northern settlements, strange happenings that may concern all our people." The hall quieted as warriors gathered to hear news that had driven men to risk winter travel. Bjorn found himself drawn forward despite his preoccupation, professional interest in potential threats overriding personal turmoil. "Speak freely," Thorvald commanded. "What troubles bring you so far in such harsh season?" Gunther accepted a steaming cup of ale before continuing, using the moment to gather his thoughts. 3 days passed. Old Halvard the Skald arrived at our settlement, claiming to carry urgent messages for the bloodline guardians of several clans. He bore tokens and artifacts that spoke of ancient debts come due. The words hit Bjorn like physical blows. Eldar had not simply vanished. He was actively working to contact other families, connected to whatever web of obligations surrounded Ketil's crimes. The scope of the old man's plan was larger than Bjorn had imagined. "This Halvard," Thorvald said carefully. "Describe him." Elderly, white-haired, carrying himself with the dignity of one who had seen much learning. He spoke the old tongue fluently and demonstrated knowledge of bloodlines that surprised our wisest elders. But there was something in his manner, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere storytelling. Bjorn's stomach clenched as recognition crystallized. Halvard was clearly another name Eldar used, possibly his true identity revealed only to those who needed to know it. The systematic nature of his approach suggested decades of careful planning, not the impulsive act of a grieving survivor. "What manner of tokens did he bear?" asked Magnus, his warrior's instincts aroused by talk of ancient debts and mysterious messages. Gunther's companion, who had remained silent until now, reached into his traveling pouch and withdrew an object that sent ice through Bjorn's veins. Another carved bone token, this one depicting a great hall in flames while figures fled into the darkness. The craftsmanship was identical to the ones hidden in Bjorn's box, part of the same deliberate collection. He left this with our Jarl, along with instructions that it be shared with the leaders of allied settlements. The message, when finally translated by our oldest Skald, spoke of a gathering at the ancient stone circle north of Ravensham, a settling of accounts that had waited 3 generations. The words fell into the hall's silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of unease through the assembled warriors. Bjorn felt every eye in the room turning toward him, though he could not tell if their attention was mere curiosity or growing suspicion. Thorvald examined the token with the careful attention of a man who had survived 30 years of leadership by recognizing danger in all its forms. When is this gathering to take place? Tomorrow night, at the rise of the winter moon. Halvard was very specific about the timing, claimed that certain rituals required the proper celestial alignment. Gunther's voice carried a note of skepticism that suggested he placed little faith in such mystical concerns. But Bjorn knew the timing was not about ritual, it was about pressure. Eldar had calculated exactly how long each recipient would need to receive their summons, process the implications, and make their choice. The old Skald was orchestrating events with the precision of a master tactician. Did this Halvard say who was expected to attend this gathering? Ragnhild asked from her position near the healing hearth. Her question seemed casual, but Bjorn caught the subtle glance she directed toward him. Representatives of bloodlines connected to ancient grievances, according to the token's message. Families whose ancestors had unfinished business that required resolution. Gunther paused, studying the faces around him. He mentioned the Ketilson line specifically. The statement hit the hall like a thunderclap. Every eye turned toward Bjorn, expectant and concerned. He felt exposed, as if his guilt was written across his features for all to read. The moment stretched endlessly while he struggled to control his expression. The Ketilson line is no unfinished business with any clan, Magnus declared with typical bluster. Bjorn's ancestors were honorable warriors who earned their reputation through valor and wisdom. If someone claims otherwise, let them face our response. The irony of Magnus defending a reputation built on lies made Bjorn's throat close with shame. These good people trusted him, believed in the honor of his bloodline, and were prepared to fight for a legacy that was rotten at its foundation. What response did your Jarl give to this summons? Thorvald asked, his voice carefully neutral. He sent word that Blackstone Ridge acknowledges no debt to unknown accusers. Gunther replied, Our bloodlines are clean, our honor intact. We have no need to justify ourselves to mysterious messengers bearing ancient tokens. The response drew approving nods from around the hall. It was the natural reaction of proud warriors who owed allegiance only to proven leaders and established law. But Bjorn knew that such dismissal would not satisfy the forces Eldar was gathering. The old Skald had not spent 30 years collecting evidence only to accept defiant refusals. However, Gunther continued, his expression growing more troubled, Halvard's departure left complications. Strange signs appeared around our settlement, more carved tokens, symbols burned into trees. Messages that seemed to promise consequences for those who ignored the summons. The hall erupted in angry muttering. Warriors spoke of retaliation and the need to track down this mysterious troublemaker. Young Olaf's voice rose above the others, declaring his readiness to hunt the old Skald and settle matters with steel rather than words. But Bjorn heard different implications in Gunther's report. Eldar was not simply requesting attendance at his gathering. He was ensuring it through calculated pressure. Those who refused to come would face escalating harassment until they either complied or took more drastic action. These symbols and tokens, Thorvald said thoughtfully. Were they similar to the one found by our hunting party yesterday? Gunther nodded grimly. Identical in style and craftsmanship. It seems this Halvard has been busy across all the northern settlements, delivering his messages to multiple bloodlines. The revelation painted a picture of coordination that made Bjorn's blood run cold. Eldar had not simply learned about Ketil's crimes. He had mapped out all the families connected to them, identified their current representatives, and was systematically calling in debts across the entire region. The gathering at Ravensham would not be a simple confrontation between accuser and accused, but a complex tribunal involving multiple bloodlines and their associated guilt. as discussion swirled around him about proper responses and potential threats. Bjorn retreated into his own thoughts. The carved box hidden beneath his cloak seemed to burn against his ribs, its contents suddenly feeling like evidence that others might also possess. How many families had received similar artifacts? How many warriors were wrestling with revelations about their ancestors' crimes? The scope of Eldar's plan was becoming clear, and with it the true magnitude of the choice before him. Tomorrow night at Ravensham, he would not face a simple demand for personal justice. He would confront a carefully orchestrated reckoning that had the potential to reshape the balance of power across all the northern settlements. The only question remaining was whether he would meet that reckoning as a defender of lies or a seeker of truth. The afternoon brought a council meeting that Bjorn dreaded attending, but could not avoid without raising suspicions. Thorvald had summoned his most trusted advisors to discuss the implications of Gunther's message and determine Hrafnheim's response to the mysterious summons. The great hall's atmosphere felt charged with tension as weathered warriors gathered around the central fire, their faces grave with the weight of unknown threats. Bjorn took his customary place at Thorvald's right hand, the position of honor that now felt like a mockery of everything he had believed about himself. The carved box pressed against his ribs with each breath, its contents a constant reminder of the deception at the heart of his respected position. "The question before us is simple," Thorvald began, his voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. "Do we acknowledge this summons to Ravensham, or do we treat it as the empty threat of a madman?" Magnus leaned forward, his scarred face twisted with contempt. "What is there to consider? Some aging skald appears with ancient tokens and fairy tales about blood debts, and we are supposed to dance to his tune? I say we send a war party to find this Halvard and settle his complaints with steel." Approving murmurs rippled through the assembled men. It was the natural response of warriors who had spent their lives solving problems through strength and courage. But Bjorn saw the trap that Magnus could not violence against. Eldar would only confirm the very charges the old skald was making. It would transform a grievance about past atrocities into fresh crimes committed in the present. "And if we kill the messenger," asked Eriksson the Tall, "what of the message itself? Others have received these tokens, heard these accusations. Silencing one voice will not end the whispers." The observation brought uncomfortable silence. Bjorn watched faces around the circle as men grappled with implications they could not fully understand. They were brave warriors, honorable in their way, but they lacked the crucial knowledge that would make sense of the situation. "What do we know of this Ketilson blood debt?" Thorvald asked, turning toward Bjorn with trust that felt like a dagger to the heart. "Your family's history stretches back to the founding of our settlement. Have you heard any stories that might explain these accusations?" The moment Bjorn had been dreading had arrived. Every eye in the circle focused on him, expecting the wisdom and honesty they had always received from their trusted champion. The lie he told now would shape everything that followed, potentially leading good men into danger they could not comprehend. "My grandfather spoke sometimes of Ketil the Wise," Bjorn said carefully, each word feeling like betrayal. "He was remembered as a strong leader who established our bloodline's reputation through fair dealings and honorable conduct. But the stories were old, and details were often unclear. The partial truth felt like acid in his mouth. He had indeed heard stories of Ketil the Wise, but now knew them to be elaborate fabrications designed to hide the reality of Ketil the Bloody. Every tale of wisdom and honor was a lie constructed to protect the family's reputation. "Then perhaps these accusations stem from rivalry rather than real grievance," suggested young Olaf, his eagerness to defend his heroes clear in every word. Enemy clans often invent historical justifications for present conflicts. Bjorn wanted to warn them all, to explain that the enemy they faced was not rival warriors, but the accumulated weight of genuine injustice. But revealing the truth would destroy More than just his own reputation, it would shatter the faith. These men placed in their entire social order. Ragnhild spoke from her position near the women's section of the council. Though she could not vote on matters of war, her counsel was always sought on issues affecting the community's welfare. Has anyone considered that this halberd might be telling the truth? She asked quietly, that these ancient debts might be genuine grievances seeking proper resolution? The suggestion brought uncomfortable shifting from the assembled warriors. They were prepared to face external enemies with blade and shield, but the possibility of ancestral guilt was harder to confront. If we choose to attend, Thorold said slowly, who among us should represent Rafnheim's interests? This summons specifically mentions the Ketilson line, which places the burden squarely on Bjorn's shoulders. The statement crystallized the choice that had been building throughout the discussion. Bjorn could feel the weight of expectation settling on him like a heavy cloak. These men trusted him to defend their honor and protect their community's reputation. They had no way of knowing that he carried the means of their destruction hidden beneath his own cloak. I will go to Revensham, Bjorn said quietly. The words seemed to come from someone else, spoken with a certainty his churning mind did not feel. Whatever accusations await our bloodline, they deserve to be heard and answered properly. The declaration brought approving murmurs from the assembled warriors. They saw courage in his willingness to face unknown accusers, honor in his determination to defend family reputation. But Bjorn felt only the cold certainty that he was walking toward a confrontation that would strip away everything he had believed about himself. As the council dispersed and men returned to their evening duties, Bjorn remained by the dying fire, staring into flames that seemed to mirror the burning hall depicted on the latest carved token. Tomorrow night at Revensham, the careful lies that had supported his world for 3 generations would finally crumble, leaving him to face whatever justice awaited in the ruins. The night before his departure to Revensham, Bjorn sat alone in his private alcove, staring at the artifacts spread before him on a rough woolen blanket. The silver armring, blood-stained cloth, and carved bone tokens seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the flickering candlelight. Tomorrow he would face whatever justice awaited at the ancient stone circle. But tonight he found himself desperate for any detail that might help him understand the full scope of his ancestors' crimes. He lifted the bone token once more, studying the carved scene of massacre with the careful attention of a man seeking salvation in damnation. The artistry was remarkable, each figure rendered with painstaking detail that spoke of deep personal knowledge. The artist had witnessed these events firsthand, or had access to someone who did. As he turned the token over in his hands, something caught his eye that he had missed in his earlier examination. A tiny symbol etched into the bone's edge, so small it was barely visible even in direct candlelight. He brought the token closer, squinting at the marking until its shape became clear. A raven. The symbol of the god Odin, but also the mark of the professional skald, the wandering storytellers who served as living libraries of history and law. Eldar had carved his own signature into this accusation, identifying himself as both witness and judge. But that realization led to another, more troubling observation. If Eldar had crafted this token personally, then he possessed artistic skills far beyond those of a typical wandering storyteller. The level of detail, the precision of the runic script, the quality of the carving all suggested training that took years to master. Resources that required significant patronage. Bjorn reached for Eldar's letter, reading it again with new attention to details he had missed in his initial shock. The parchment was of exceptional quality, the ink deep and permanent, the script flowing with the confidence of extensive education. This was not the crude writing of a revenge-seeking survivor, but the careful documentation of someone accustomed to creating permanent records. Horrible possibility began to take shape in his mind. What if Eldar was not simply a victim's descendant seeking personal vengeance? What if he represented something larger, more organized, more dangerous than a single old man's quest for justice? The sound of soft footsteps outside his alcove made him quickly gather the artifacts and letter, shoving them back into their hiding place beneath his sleeping furs. But the approaching steps paused just outside the hanging that served as his door, followed by a gentle scratching that indicated a visitor seeking permission to enter. "Bjorn?" Ragnhild's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know you are awake. We need to speak." He hesitated, unwilling to face her perceptive questions when his thoughts were already in turmoil. But refusing her would only increase suspicions that were already too sharp for comfort. "Enter," he said quietly, arranging himself in what he hoped appeared to be natural relaxation. Ragnhild pushed through the hanging with the silent grace of someone accustomed to moving through sleeping halls without disturbance. She carried a small oil lamp that cast steady light across the cramped space, and her expression held the serious concentration he had learned to associate with important conversations. "You leave for Ravensham at dawn," she said, settling onto a low stool beside his sleeping area. "I wanted to give you something before your departure." She reached into her healing satchel and withdrew an object that made Bjorn's breath catch, another carved bone token. But this one was different from all the others, older, cruder in execution, bearing symbols that predated even the ancient runic script he was learning to recognize. "Where did you get this?" he asked, accepting the token with hands that trembled despite his efforts at control. "My grandmother gave it to me before her death, with instructions to keep it safe until the day when old debts came calling." Ragnhild's voice carried a gravity that transformed the familiar woman into someone almost unrecognizable. She said it would be needed when the bloodline guardians gathered to settle accounts that had waited 3 generations. The words struck him like physical blows. 3 generations, the same time span mentioned in Eldar's letter. The same period that separated him from Ketil the Bloody's crimes. But Ragnhild's possession of such an artifact suggested knowledge that went far beyond what she had previously revealed. "What does it depict?" Bjorn asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "Look closely," she replied, moving the oil lamp nearer. "The carving tells a story that has been kept secret for longer than either of us has lived." In the improved light, Bjorn could make out details that had been obscured by shadow. The token showed a great hall, similar to the one depicted on the artifact found by Magnus's hunting party. But this scene was different. Instead of showing the hall in flames, it depicted the moment before the massacre. Figures approached under banners of truce, while others waited in concealment with weapons drawn. But the most shocking detail was the central figure orchestrating the ambush. A woman bearing the symbols of high rank, her face rendered with careful attention that suggested the carver knew her personally. Ancient runes around the border spelled out a name that made Bjorn's world tilt on its axis. Astrid the Truthkeeper, his great-great-grandmother, Ketil's wife, whose wisdom had supposedly guided the early establishment of their bloodline's reputation. "She planned it all," Ragnhild said quietly, watching his face for understanding. "Ketil the Bloody was merely the weapon she wielded. The true architect of your family's crimes was the woman whose name has been honored for 3 generations as a paragon of wisdom and virtue." The revelation shattered everything Bjorn thought he understood about his heritage. Not only was his family founded on murder and betrayal, but the crimes had been orchestrated by the ancestor most revered in their family stories. Astrid the Truthkeeper, whose counsel was still quoted by elders seeking to resolve disputes, had been a calculating killer who used her husband's strength to eliminate rivals and claim their lands. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Since the night Eldar arrived at our hall," she replied. "I recognized him the moment I saw his face, though he has aged greatly since last I encountered him. His true name is Halvard the Chronicler, and he has spent the past 30 years documenting the crimes of the bloodline guardians, gathering evidence, tracking down survivors, preparing for this moment." The scope of the deception crashed over him like a cold wave. Ragnhild had known the truth from the beginning, had watched him struggle with partial knowledge while possessing the full picture herself. Every conversation, every moment of apparent sympathy had been carefully calculated. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out as more accusation than inquiry. "Because you needed to discover it yourself, to make your own choices based on partial understanding." Alvard's plan required that each bloodline representative face their ancestors' crimes without outside influence, that they choose their path based on conscience rather than pressure. Her explanation revealed the true scope of what was unfolding. This was not simply about his family's guilt. It was a carefully orchestrated test of character involving multiple bloodlines across the northern settlements. Alvard had spent decades preparing a massive reckoning that would determine which families could acknowledge their past and which would cling to comfortable lies. "The gathering at Ravensham," Bjorn said slowly. "It's not about punishment, is it?" "No," Ragnhild confirmed. "It's about truth. Halvard has discovered evidence of crimes committed by the founders of 7 major bloodlines' murders, betrayals, thefts that shaped the entire political structure of our region. Tomorrow night, he will present that evidence to the current generation and offer them a choice." "What kind of choice?" "Acknowledge the crimes and work toward genuine justice for the survivor families, or continue living the lies and face the consequences of exposure." Her expression grew grave. "Because make no mistake, Bjorn Halvard has the power to destroy every major bloodline in the northern settlements. The question is whether we will reform ourselves or force him to tear down everything we have built." The magnitude of the situation finally became clear. Bjorn was not just facing a personal crisis about his family's honor. He was part of a moment that could reshape their entire civilization. The old order, built on lies and maintained through violence, was being challenged by an agent of truth who had waited 3 decades for this opportunity. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because tomorrow you will need to speak not just for yourself, but for all of us," Ragnhild replied. "The choice you make will echo through generations, just as Astrid's choices have echoed down to us. I wanted you to understand what was truly at stake." She rose to leave, then paused at the hanging. "There is one more thing you should know. Halvard is not seeking revenge. He is seeking transformation. The question is whether our people are wise enough to embrace it." After she left, Bjorn sat in the guttering lamplight, holding the 2 bone tokens that told the true story of his bloodline's foundation. Tomorrow at Ravensham, he would face not just the crimes of the past, but the possibility of redemption for the future. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. Dawn arrived gray and merciless, painting the snow-covered settlement in shades of uncertainty that matched Bjorn's turbulent thoughts. He had not slept after Ragnhild's revelation, instead spending the dark hours wrestling with implications that seemed to multiply like shadows cast by a dancing flame. The knowledge that 7 bloodlines faced similar reckonings, that the entire political structure of the northern settlements hung in the balance, transformed his personal crisis into something far more momentous. His preparations for the journey to Ravensham felt ritualistic. Each action weighted with significance he had not previously understood. Checking his weapons took on new meaning when he realized he might face not enemies, but judgment. Packing provisions became an exercise in contemplating whether he would return to the life he had known or emerge into something entirely different. The carved box containing Eldar's artifacts now shared space in his travel pack with Ragnhild's ancient token. The 2 sets of evidence creating a complete picture of his family's true history. The weight felt both heavier and lighter than before, heavier with responsibility. Lighter with the relief that comes from no longer carrying secrets alone. As he secured his pack and checked his horse's tack, familiar voices approached from the direction of the Great Hall. Magnus and young Olaf were making their way toward the stables, their breath forming clouds in the bitter morning air, their expressions mixing concern with determination. You don't ride to Ravensham alone, Magnus declared without preamble. Whatever accusations await the Ketilson line, they face the response of Raffenheim's united strength. The offer touched Bjorn deeply, while simultaneously filling him with dread. These good men were prepared to risk their lives defending a reputation they believed to be honorable, unaware that their loyalty would only compound the tragedy of truth's revelation. "This is not your burden to bear," Bjorn replied carefully. "The summons mentioned my bloodline specifically. Whatever judgment awaits, it must be faced by those responsible." "Responsible for what?" Olaf demanded, his young voice tight with indignation. "Your family's honor is beyond question. These mysterious accusations are nothing but the ravings of an enemy seeking to sow discord through lies and fear." The irony cut deep. Olaf's fierce loyalty was based on complete ignorance of the facts. Yet his willingness to risk everything for what he believed was right demonstrated the very honor that Bjorn's ancestors had lacked. The contrast between earned respect and inherited guilt had never felt more stark. "Sometimes," Bjorn said slowly, "a man must face his past alone to discover who he truly is." Magnus studied his face with the sharp attention of a veteran who had learned to read character under pressure. "There's something you're not telling us. I've known you for 15 years, Bjorn Ketilson, and never have I seen you carry such weight in your shoulders. What burden do you bear that you cannot share with brothers who would gladly help carry it?" The temptation to confess everything nearly overwhelmed him. Magnus deserved the truth, as did Olaf and all the others who trusted him. But revealing the evidence in his pack would destroy their faith, not just in him, but in the entire social structure they depended upon for meaning and security. "Some truths are too dangerous to share until their time arrives," he said finally. "Today at Ravensham, that time may come. If it does, I trust you to judge me by the choices I make, not the legacy I inherited." The cryptic response clearly frustrated both warriors, but they respected his right to privacy even when they disagreed with his decision. After extracting promises that he would send word if he needed assistance, they reluctantly allowed him to depart alone. The ride north through snow-covered valleys gave Bjorn hours to contemplate what awaited him at the ancient stone circle. According to Ragnhild's revelations, representatives of 7 bloodlines would gather to face evidence of their ancestors' crimes. Each would be forced to choose between acknowledging uncomfortable truths or defending comfortable lies, with consequences that could reshape their entire civilization. But what form would those consequences take? Halvard clearly possessed detailed evidence of historical crimes, but evidence alone was not enough to topple established power structures. The old chronicler must have some leverage, some means of ensuring that his revelations could not simply be dismissed or silenced through violent stod as the afternoon sun tracked across overcast skies. Bjorn found himself studying the landscape with new eyes. These valleys and ridges had witnessed the original crimes, had absorbed the blood of innocents murdered under flags of truce. The very ground beneath his horse's hooves was stained with injustices that had shaped the current world through deception and selective memory. The approach to Ravensham revealed signs of other travelers converging on the ancient site. Horse tracks in the snow spoke of riders arriving from multiple directions, some traveling alone, others in small groups that suggested family delegations. By Bjorn's count, at least 12 horses had passed this way within the previous day, indicating that Halvard's summons had indeed reached all intended recipients. The stone circle itself sat on a windswept hilltop that commanded views of the surrounding valleys, its ancient monoliths rising like grave markers against the gray sky. Even from a distance, Bjorn could see figures moving among the stones, some mounted, others standing in small clusters that suggested tense conversations. Smoke from several small fires indicated that many had arrived early and established camps for what promised to be a long night's work. As he guided his horse up to final approach, Bjorn began to recognize faces among the gathering. Jarl Soren of Ironwood Ridge stood near the circle's center, his weathered features set in lines of defensive suspicion. The twins Ragnar and Rolf from Stormhaven flanked their elderly father, their hands resting casually on weapon hilts in the manner of men expecting trouble. Even proud Ingvar the Black had come, his massive frame unmistakable despite the heavy cloak that wrapped his shoulders. These were not weak men easily intimidated by threats or accusations. They represented some of the most powerful bloodlines in the northern settlements, warriors whose strength had been proven in countless battles and whose honor had never been publicly questioned. Whatever evidence Halvard possessed would need to be overwhelming to move such men toward acknowledgement of ancestral guilt. At the circle's northern edge, a familiar figure stood alone beside a carefully banked fire. Even at distance, Bjorn recognized Halvard, the man he had known as Eldar, though the transformation in bearing was remarkable. Gone was the bent posture and uncertain movement of the aging skald. In their place stood someone who radiated quiet authority, whose presence commanded attention despite his modest stature. As Bjorn dismounted and secured his horse among the others, Halvard approached with measured steps. The old man's eyes held no warmth, but neither did they burn with the hatred Bjorn had expected. Instead, they reflected the patient determination of someone who had waited 30 years for this moment and would not be hurried now that it had arrived. "Bjorn Ketilson," Halvard said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. "I wondered if you would come. Did you doubt it?" "I doubted many things about your character during those months at Rafnheim, but your presence here suggests that doubt was misplaced." The old chronicler studied his face with the intensity of someone reading ancient runes. "Tell me, young warrior, what did you discover in the box I left?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Bjorn realized that this was the first test, the moment when his character would be measured against the evidence of his ancestors' crimes. "I discovered that my family's honor was built on lies," he said simply. "That Ketil the Wise was actually Ketil the Bloody, and that the foundation of my bloodline was murder and betrayal." Halvard nodded slowly. "And how did that knowledge change you?" Bjorn considered the question carefully, aware that his answer would influence everything that followed. "It taught me that inherited honor is worthless unless it is redeemed through personal choice. That the measure of a man lies not in what his ancestors did, but in how he responds when their crimes are revealed." "Then you are ready for what comes next," Halvard said. "The others are still arriving, but we will begin soon. Tonight, 7 bloodlines will face the truth about their foundations. Some will choose wisdom, others will choose pride. The future of our people depends on which choice prevails." As shadows lengthened across the ancient stones, Bjorn felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. Whatever happened in the hours ahead would echo through generations, just as the crimes they had gathered to address had echoed down to them. The only question was whether that echo would carry the sound of justice finally served, or violence perpetuating itself across another generation. The gathering storm of reckoning was about to break, and Bjorn stood at its very center, the ancient stone circle filled with tension as thick as the gathering twilight. 7 great fires had been lit between the monoliths, their flames casting dancing shadows across faces that would determine the future of the northern settlements. The assembled representatives sat in careful arrangement, each bloodline maintaining enough distance for weapons to be drawn if negotiations collapsed into violence. Halvard stood at the circle's center, his aged frame somehow commanding absolute attention from men who had never bowed to any authority but their own strength. In his hands, he held a leather satchel that seemed to contain the weight of decades. "You came," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the sacred space. "Despite your power, your pride, your certainty that the past holds no claims on the present, you came. That alone suggests wisdom may yet prevail over stubbornness." Jarl Soren of Ironwood Ridge shifted uncomfortably, his scarred face reflecting firelight. You summoned us with threats and mysteries, old man. We came to hear your accusations and judge their worth. Speak plainly. What do you want? Justice, Halvor replied without hesitation. Not the crude justice of blade and blood that your ancestors preferred, but the deeper justice of truth acknowledged and wrongs made right. He opened the satchel and withdrew the first artifact, holding it high for all to see. A silver torque twisted with expert craftsmanship, its surface bearing intricate knotwork that marked it as exceptionally valuable. This belonged to my sister Gudrun, wife to the Jarl of Thornwick Valley. She wore it the night your ancestors came under flags of truce, seeking shelter from winter storms. His voice remained steady, but something in his tone made several warriors reach unconsciously for their weapons. She died wearing it while her children slept nearby, trusting in guest right to protect them. Ingvar the Black leaned forward, his massive frame tense with challenge. Ancient accusations require ancient proof. How do we know this trinket belonged to anyone but yourself? Without speaking, Halvor turned the torque, revealing runic inscriptions along its inner surface. He read them aloud in the old tongue, then translated, Gudrun Erik's daughter, beloved of Thorkel Stormcrow, mother of future Jarls, keeper of the sacred flame. The formal inscription carried the weight of official recognition, marking the torque as ceremonial. But Halvor was not finished. From his satchel came scorched wood bearing partial runic carving and a fragment of fine cloth stained dark with old blood. These were taken from the ruins of Thornwick Hall after your ancestors finished their night's work. 7 families dead, their children murdered in their beds, their wealth divided among the killers who claimed to be guests. The accusation fell across the gathering like a hammer blow. Bjorn felt his own guilt magnified as he watched other faces register shock, denial, and growing understanding. You speak of our ancestors as if we were present, growled Ragnar of Stormhaven. Even if these events occurred as you claim, what responsibility do we bear for deeds committed before our births? Halvard's expression remained patient, but his eyes hardened. You bear the responsibility of those who have benefited from crimes while denying they occurred. Your wealth, your lands, your very positions of leadership, all built on the bones of those your ancestors murdered. He withdrew a larger object that made every warrior tense. A ceremonial axe, its blade etched with symbols of power, its handle wrapped in gold wire. But the blade was stained with something that had never been cleaned away. This belonged to Ketil the Bloody, though his descendants know him as Ketil the Wise. Halvard's gaze found Bjorn across the circle. He used it to cut down families who trusted him, then passed it to his son as a symbol of honor rather than shame. The moment had come when Bjorn could no longer remain silent. The weight of his ancestors' crimes pressed against his chest like a physical burden. I have seen the evidence of Ketil's crimes, he said quietly. The bone tokens depicting massacre, the blood-stained cloth from his victims, the silver arm ring bearing his true name. Everything this man says about my ancestor is true. The confession struck like lightning. Several Jarls turned toward him with shock and betrayal, while others leaned forward with predatory interest. Fool! Soren snarled, his hand moving to his sword hilt. Do you realize what you've done? By admitting to ancient crimes, you give legitimacy to every wild accusation this charlatan might make. Truth does not become false simply because acknowledging it is inconvenient, Bjorn replied steadily. My great-grandfather was a murderer and oath-breaker. No amount of pride or bluster will change that fact. Halvard nodded approvingly at Bjorn's confession, then turned his attention to the other representatives. Bjorn Ketilson has shown the courage to face uncomfortable truth. The question remaining is whether the rest of you possess similar wisdom. From his satchel came the final artifact, a wooden tablet covered in runic script. Its surface darkened with age, but still clearly legible. The craftsmanship spoke of official documentation, the kind of record that only the most important events warranted. The Chronicle of the Thornwick Compact. Halvard announced, written in the hand of Astrid the Truthkeeper herself. A detailed plan for the coordinated elimination of rival bloodlines, complete with assignments of targets and distribution of stolen wealth. The tablet's existence changed everything. This was not testimony of bitter survivors or interpretation of ambiguous evidence. This was the conspirators' own documentation, preserved in their own words. The silence that followed stretched like a bowstring under tension. Each representative studied the ancient tablet with expressions ranging from disbelief to dawning horror. If authentic, this document proved their ancestors had participated in calculated genocide. "Let me read the opening passage," Halvard said, his voice carrying authority. Written in Astrid's own hand, "The compact sworn this night shall bind our bloodlines in common purpose. 7 families hold lands and wealth that rightfully belong to stronger hands. Through coordinated action, we shall claim what the weak cannot defend." The words fell across the gathering like stones into still water. This was not desperate raiders or impulsive violence, but premeditated murder planned with chilling calculation. "Lies," Soren whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. Halvard continued reading. "Ketil shall take Thornwick under guest right, claiming winter shelter before striking at dawn. Ingvar's line claims Ravensborg through marriage dispute turned violent. The twins of Stormhaven divide the coastal settlements between them. With each line, another bloodline's guilt was exposed." The representatives named in the Chronicle shifted uncomfortably as their ancestors. Assigned roles were revealed in damning detail. "Even if this tablet is genuine," Ingvar rumbled, his massive hands clenched into fists, "it speaks of ancient history. The dead cannot be brought back. The stolen lands have been worked by honest hands for generations. What justice can possibly be served now?" "The justice of acknowledgement," Halvard replied firmly. "The justice of compensation to surviving bloodlines, who have lived in poverty while you prospered from their ancestors' deaths. The justice of truth finally spoken after 3 generations of comfortable lies." He gestured toward the shadows beyond the circle, and for the first time, the representatives noticed figures emerging from the darkness. Men and women wrapped in rough cloaks, their faces gaunt with hardship, but their bearing proud despite evident poverty. They moved with quiet dignity into the firelight, revealing features that spoke of noble bloodlines fallen on harsh times. "Meet the true heirs of the families your ancestors destroyed," Halvard said. "They have survived in exile, preserving their histories, waiting for the day when justice would finally be possible." Bjorn counted at least 20 figures, ranging from elderly patriarchs to children barely old enough to understand the magnitude of what was unfolding. These were the descendants of massacre survivors, living proof that the crimes had not been as complete as the perpetrators had believed. An elderly woman stepped forward, her weathered face bearing the unmistakable dignity of high birth despite her humble clothes. "I am Solveig, last daughter of the Thornwick line. My grandmother escaped the massacre as a child, carrying nothing but the memory of her family's screams. For 3 generations we have waited for this moment." Her words carried the weight of accumulated grief and determination. Around her, the other survivors nodded, their faces reflecting similar stories of loss and patient endurance. "What do you want from us?" Ragnar demanded, his twin brother's face echoing the same defensive anger. "Recognition," Solveig replied simply. "Acknowledgement of what was taken from us. A portion of the wealth that rightfully belongs to our bloodlines, enough to restore our place among the settlement hierarchies." "Impossible," Soren snarled. "You ask us to bankrupt ourselves for crimes we did not commit, to elevate strangers at the expense of our own people." "We ask you honor debts your ancestors incurred," Halvard corrected. "To choose justice over comfort, truth over convenient fiction." The moment of decision had arrived. Bjorn could feel the weight of history pressing down on the circle, could sense the future teetering on the edge of choices that would echo through generations. Around him, the representatives of 7 powerful bloodlines wrestled with implications that could destroy everything they had built. "I will honor the debt," Bjorn said suddenly, his voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. "Whatever my ancestors stole from the Thornwick line, whatever compensation justice demands, the Ketilson bloodline will provide." His declaration sent shockwaves through the gathering. By accepting responsibility, he was again validating the entire premise of Halvard's demands, making it impossible for others to dismiss the accusations as fabrications. "You speak for yourself alone," Ingvar growled. "The rest of us make our own choices." But the pressure was mounting. The evidence was overwhelming, the moral weight of truth bearing down on men who had spent their lives believing in their own righteousness. One by one, Bjorn watched faces change as the reality of their situation became clear. They could choose acknowledgement and face the difficult work of making amends. Or they could choose denial and face whatever consequences Halvard had prepared for those who refused justice. 3 years had passed since that winter night at Ravensham's stone circle, and the northern settlements had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Bjorn stood at the edge of Rathmheim's expanded fields, watching Solveig's grandsons work alongside his own people in the harvest that would sustain them all through another winter. The integration had not been seamless, but it had been genuine. Of the 7 bloodlines called to account that night, 3 had chosen acknowledgement over denial. Bjorn's acceptance of the Thornwick debt had been followed by similar decisions from the younger representatives of 2 other families, men whose conscience had proven stronger than their pride. The remaining 4 had chosen differently, and the consequences of that choice still rippled through the region. Soren single quotes S rejection of Halvard's demands had led to a systematic campaign of exposure that ultimately destroyed his credibility among the northern jarls. The evidence of his bloodline's crimes, presented methodically to every settlement and trading post, had transformed him from respected leader to pariah. His lands now belonged to survivors who had waited 3 generations for justice, while he lived in exile beyond the mountains. Ingvar the Black had chosen violence, attempting to silence Halvard and the survivors through the same methods his ancestors had preferred. The resulting conflict had cost him his life and scattered his followers, leaving his territories to be claimed by those with cleaner hands and clearer conscience. The other 2 holdouts had met similar fates, their refusal to bend ultimately breaking them entirely. But for those who had chosen truth, the path had led to unexpected renewal. The integration of survivor families had brought new skills, new perspectives, and new alliances that strengthened the settlements in ways that mere wealth never could. Trade partnerships flourished with communities that had previously viewed the northern settlements with suspicion. Marriage bonds between formerly separated bloodlines created networks of cooperation that spanned the entire region. "The afternoon light suits you, my friend," said a familiar voice behind him. Bjorn turned to find Halvard approaching through the golden grain, his bearing still carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in the stone circle. The years had aged him visibly, but his eyes remained sharp with the intelligence that had orchestrated such a complete transformation of their world. "I was thinking about choices," Bjorn replied, making space for the chronicler beside him. "How different everything might have been if courage had failed me that night." "Courage did not fail you," Halvard corrected gently. "That is why you stand here today as a leader your people truly respect, rather than a fraud they followed through ignorance." The observation carried truth that Bjorn had come to appreciate. The revelation of his ancestors' crimes had indeed destroyed the comfortable lies that had supported his authority, but it had also created space for something more valuable: leadership based on character rather than inherited reputation. "Ragnhild told me you planned to depart soon," he said, though part of him hoped the information was incorrect. "My work here is finished," Halvard confirmed. The debts have been acknowledged, the survivors restored, the truth finally spoken after 3 generations of silence. What comes next belongs to your generation to determine. They stood in companionable silence, watching the mixed groups of workers bring in the harvest that would sustain them all. Children ran between the grain stalks, their laughter carrying on the autumn wind without regard for which bloodlines had birthed them. In their play, Bjorn could see the future that their choices at Ravensham had made possible. "Will you tell me your true name before you leave?" he asked. Halvard smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Halvard is my true name, though I have carried others when circumstances demanded. My family died at Thornwick, alongside all the rest. But I survived because I was away learning the chronicler's art. I returned to find only graves and lies." 30 years of preparation for one night's work, Bjorn mused. The patience required must have been extraordinary. "Not patience," Halvard corrected. "Purpose. When you know that justice delayed is not justice denied, you can wait as long as necessary for the right moment to arrive." As evening approached, they walked back toward the hall where Thorvald would soon call for the harvest feast. The celebration would bring together bloodlines that had been separated for generations, united now by shared truth rather than comfortable deceptions. "One final question," Bjorn said, as they reached the hall's entrance. "Was there ever a moment when you doubted? When the weight of what you were attempting seemed too great to bear?" Halvard paused, considering the question with the careful attention it deserved. "Every day for 30 years, he admitted. But then I would remember Gudrun's face in the firelight, or hear the echo of children's laughter cut short, and the doubt would pass. Some burdens become lighter when they are finally shared." The old chronicler's words carried the wisdom of someone who had transformed personal tragedy into collective healing. As they entered the warmth of the great hall, where former enemies now sat as neighbors around the same hearth, Bjorn understood that the true victory at Ravensham had not been the exposure of ancient crimes, but the courage to build something better from there. Acknowledgement. The harvest feast began as the sun set behind the mountains, its light fading on a world transformed by truth. In the hall's warmth, surrounded by people who knew the worst of their shared history yet chose to move forward together, Bjorn finally understood what honor truly meant when earned rather than inherited. Sometimes, the greatest acts of courage happen not in battle, but in the quiet moments when we choose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and hope over the safety of familiar lies. The story that began with a giant warrior feeding an old man had become something larger, a testament to the power of conscience and the possibility of redemption. Even after 3 generations of darkness, outside, snow began to fall on the land finally at peace with its past.